Talking about the best ever, maybe, in this week's edition of The First Line, presented by Bally Sports. He's Pete Blackburn. I'm Frank Seravalli of DailyFaceoff.com. Pete, the Boston Bruins, your Boston Bruins, set the NHL record for most wins in a regular season with their 63rd win on Sunday night in Philadelphia. A raucous crowd chanting, "We want the cup," for a road game. Amazing scene when what's been an amazing season for the Bruins. But as this team has now set the record, are they the best regular season team of all time?
I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I watch like the 70s Canadians and, I'm going to compare them based off the eras and stuff like that. It's just earlier than my time, but like whenever I think of that era of hockey and I look at what the game is now, it's completely different. So it's very hard to compare those two, but I do think of I think of goalies standing directly straight up. I think of guys smoking cigs in the locker room, pounding beers in between periods. So, I do think this Bruins team would wipe the floor with a lot of those teams. And based on what I've seen over, my couple decades of watching hockey, this is the best regular season team that I've ever seen, not only for the Bruins, but in general, because they've been the best team in the league from day one to what seems like it's going to be game 82. So it's very rare that you see a team have that sort of consistency and be that dominant from the starting line to the finish line. So the depth is unbelievable. You look at Pastrnak scoring 60 goals, Linus Ullmark leading basically every goaltending category. I think this team has everything that you would look for in a dominant team, and I would say that they're the best team that's ever existed in the NHL's regular season.
Wow, it's a strong statement. I just have a hard time getting there because the game is so different just from a pure standings perspective. Like, yes, is what the Boston Bruins have done and accomplished this season incredible? 100%. And I'm not taking anything away from anything that they've accomplished. And when it's all said and done, they will lead in wins and points in the standings. But I just think of the way the shootout works, the fact that ties used to be in existence then. And I think back to those late 70s Canadiens teams, and I think of the Bruins, I say only having 52 wins in regulation to this point. Those Canadiens teams had 60. And 60 is a big difference than 52 when it comes to winning in regulation, not winning in the shootout, not winning in overtime. So it just kind of feels to me like a record, but one that has an asterisk. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess. But I mean, like you were saying that the game has changed so much. I give that portion of the credit to the Bruins because these games are, the game is so much different. It's so much tougher, and it is a lot more competitive in terms of what we've seen in terms of the parity over the past couple decades. And very rarely have we seen a team this dominant in a league where the game is so much more competitive.
And totally agree. I agree with your assessment too, that the Bruins would wipe the floor with those Montreal Canadiens, most likely. Totally different era, although they did have some special players. The game is totally different, and the Bruins are also doing it in a salary cap. So I am defeating my own argument, but I just think when you look at it all on paper, it's a totally different standings format to just say wins against wins. It's not really quite the same thing. Let's talk about the Florida Panthers, who have been scratching and clawing their way to a Stanley Cup playoff spot. They can clinch as early as Monday night and would further cut off the Pittsburgh Penguins' supply of oxygen. So, two-part question. One, who is the Florida Panthers MVP? Is it Matthew Tkachuk or is it his dad in Keith Tkachuk?
I mean, I'll give more credit to Matthew Tkachuk because he puts on the uniform, but Keith Tkachuk, I don't know. I'm not going to rule out the fact that what he said about that team and them being soft could have put a spark in that team. But ultimately, I don't think it's either of those guys. I think it's Alex Lyon. I mean, he's 4-0 in the month of April with a .965 save percentage. I don't think either of the Tkachuks just magically told him to start going out there and playing elite level goaltending. And I really do think that this team is good goaltending away from being a pretty good team and being a playoff caliber team. And so that's something that came to them at the exact right time for them to put together a run and possibly sneak in.
Yeah, I can't sidestep the comments though from Big Walt. Keith Tkachuk, when's the last time you heard any hockey parent anywhere go on arguably the biggest radio market in the league in Toronto and say that their team is soft and they don't work? and then highlight your other son's team, Brady's team in Ottawa, which has significantly less talent, and say that they give a much more consistent effort night tonight. It almost felt like it was planned. Like, you never see that happen.
Yeah, and
the Panthers are 5-0 since then.
And I think, like, in any other situation across the league, somebody's dad calling their team soft would be considered a negative distraction. But if there's one guy that can get away with it, it's probably Keith Tkachuk. And honestly, he's not wrong. Like, the one knock against the Panthers have always been that they're kind of soft, that they kind of fold. And, you know, I know they had a great regular season last year, but they flamed out and they just can't outscore their problems. So I know it's a different team this year, but again, I'm not willing to rule out that helped.
Yeah, and Matthew Tkachuk, no one even really talked about him. He's only 31 points clear of his next closest teammate in Alexander Barkov. He has 108 points, 40-plus goals. Again, one of the true franchise players in the NHL. So let's talk about the Pittsburgh Penguins side of it. If the Penguins fall short, what would be your first move if you owned the Pittsburgh Penguins? I'm going to say make a GM change. It feels to me, Pete, like there are some wheels that are in motion in Pittsburgh. I think even if they end up losing in the first round, there's certainly been some friction there, it seems, between Mike Sullivan and the general manager and Ron Hextall. And I just can't figure out the direction of where this Penguins team goes next. You've got all these guys, Crosby, Letang, Malkin, signed for long term. Crosby has 2 years left on his deal. That's the shortest of those deals. How much different could they possibly look on the ice next season?
Yeah, I think that's a big problem, right? You can't invent a time machine and go back to last summer and reverse those long-term deals that you gave out to a lot of aging veterans. Like, you look at their salary cap structure, and they're kind of locked into a lot of these guys for several years moving forward, especially up front. So, you know, I would look at maybe a change in leadership, because you're right, you know, the direction of this team is pretty muddled. But if you're not going to change the leadership, if you want to talk about the structure of this team, I think they need to reshape the blue line. The blue line has not been nearly good enough. And you look at their expected goals numbers and the goals that they actually have given up this season, that team's not nearly good enough defensively. And again, you're pretty much locked into a lot of guys up front. You can make some changes on the back end. I don't know if they're going to be able to make the significant changes. I don't know if they have the flexibility to make those significant changes on the blue line. I think this team is in kind of a really rough spot in terms of no man's land, where they're not going to be bad in terms of entering the lottery, but they're not going to be good enough to be considered serious contenders either, I think.
Yeah, with Buffalo, Ottawa, Detroit all on the come, I mean, it certainly seems like the Pittsburgh Penguins, maybe even the Islanders, they don't get in this year. When is the next time they do get in? The Penguins, their pipeline for prospects is also pretty thin. And Tristan Jarry, their goaltender, is a pending unrestricted free agent. Quickly, Pete, we had some juicy quotes over the weekend. Certainly seems like some players ran out of their give a bleep meter. What was the more juicy quote? Was it Bo Horvat throwing shade at the Vancouver Canucks? Or was it Chris Weidman whining about the Leafs putting an amateur goalie in for garbage time on Saturday night?
I definitely think it's Horvat by a mile, because you very rarely see a guy go at the throat of the team that he played for earlier that season, maybe years down the road, where like the statute of limitations has passed on dumping on your former team. But Horvat throwing a shot in the middle or immediately after a game and saying this is so much better, and like you can't even really blame him, because Vancouver is a mess, and the vibes in Vancouver have been off for a couple of years to this point, and you could tell that, you know, towards the end of his tenure, he couldn't even wait to get out of there. So I don't blame him there. I just think the Weidman thing comes off as way more whiny and babyish, especially when you're getting your doors blown off and you're a team towards the bottom of the league. You kind of just got to shut up and take it and wait for the season to end and just move on and get on with your summer. So the Horvat thing moved the needle for me. The Weidman thing just seemed like he was whining and being a little bit of a baby.
I don't know, in every dig, there's always a kernel of truth, and he said the Toronto Maple Leafs will get theirs in a couple weeks, and history has proven the last 6 years.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with an e-bug. It's just the Toronto Maple Leafs loving to puke on themselves in the playoffs.
Well, there could be that too.